when the bank took everything from 63-year-old Vietnam veteran Richard Thornton, except his family's century-old farm. They told him to shut down the small runway his father had built in 1954, but something made Richard keep mowing that grass landing strip week after week, even as financial ruin closed in around him. It was just a feeling, he later told investigators, like someone was whispering to me that it mattered. On the stormy night of August 17th, as foreclosure notices plastered his farmhouse door, Richard was awakened by the deafening roar of failing engines. Looking up, he saw the impossible. A C-17 Globemaster III, one of the largest military transport planes in the world, desperately seeking anywhere to land. What happened next defied aviation experts and changed U.S. military protocol forever. The split-second decision that saved 157 lives and revealed the classified cargo that the government never wanted you to know about. If you're seeing this, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell right now. You won't believe what this farmer discovered on his land. Drop a comment below with what you would have done if a military plane tried to land on your property. Richard Thornton's weathered hands moved methodically across the John Deere tractor's controls, guiding it up and down the 5,000-foot grass runway that bisected his 180-acre farm in rural Nebraska. At 63, his body ached from decades of hard labor, but maintaining this airstrip was a ritual he refused to abandon. Your granddad would be proud, Sarah, his wife of 41 years, called from the porch as he finished his weekly mowing. She didn't add what they both knew, that this might be the last time he performed this task. The foreclosure notice had arrived yesterday, the culmination of 5 years of struggling harvests, rising equipment costs, and his ongoing medical bills. The bank had given them 30 days to vacate the property his family had worked for 4 generations. "Don't see why you bother with that old strip," their son Michael said later that evening, studying spreadsheets at the kitchen table in a last-ditch effort to save the farm. "Nobody's landed here in, 3 years?" Richard sipped his coffee, gazing out the window at the perfectly maintained runway. "Your grandfather built it to fly crop dusters, then for the flying club. It's part of this land." "It's not even registered with the FAA anymore," Michael countered. "The bank specifically said to stop maintaining it. Liability concerns." Sarah placed a gentle hand on her husband's shoulder. "What's the harm in letting him have this, Michael, if we're losing it all anyway?" The truth was, Richard himself couldn't explain his compulsion to keep the runway operational. The small regional airport 20 miles away had long since captured what little aviation traffic came through this part of the state. The flying club had disbanded a decade ago. The last emergency landing had been a Cessna with engine trouble back in 2019, yet every week without fail, he mowed the strip, checked the windsock, and kept the old aviation radio in the barn charged and functional, tuned to the emergency frequency. "Just habit, I guess," he told his skeptical son. But it was more than that. Since returning from Vietnam in 1979, where he'd served as an Air Force mechanic, something about maintaining a safe landing zone felt like a duty he couldn't abandon. That night, as a summer storm rolled across the plains, Richard stood on the porch, watching lightning flicker on the horizon. The weather matched his mood, turbulent, threatening, with no clear end in sight. In 2 days, the bank representative would return with final paperwork. By next month, some corporate farming operation would likely own the land, plow under the runway, and erase one more piece of local history. "Coming to bed?" Sarah called from inside. "Soon," he replied, his eyes drawn to the distant sky where, just for a moment, he thought he saw lights moving through the storm clouds. 40,000 feet above Nebraska, Captain Melissa Rodriguez fought to keep the massive C-17 Globemaster III stable as warning indicators flashed across her instrument panel. What had begun as unusual engine vibration had rapidly cascaded into a critical situation. "McConnell approach. This is Air Force 37129, declaring emergency," she announced, her voice steady despite the aircraft's violent shuddering. "Multiple engine malfunctions, electrical system compromise, requesting immediate vectors to nearest suitable runway. Beside her, First Lieutenant James Park worked feverishly through emergency checklists. Engine 3 is gone. Engine 4 is overheating. We've got 15 minutes of reliable power maximum. In the cargo hold, Master Sergeant Derek Wilson moved between the secured pallets containing their classified payload, experimental medical equipment bound for the CDC in Atlanta, and the 23 military personnel and civilian specialists accompanying it. The turbulence had intensified and throwing several passengers against their restraints. "Status report," came Rodriguez's voice through his headset. "2 injuries, nothing critical," Wilson replied. "Cargo remains secure, but we've got warning lights on the environmental system." "Understood. Prepare for possible rapid descent and emergency landing." The situation deteriorated with alarming speed. As they descended through 25,000 feet, Engine 4 failed completely, sending the massive transport into a controlled but concerning right bank. The electrical system fluctuated, temporarily cutting communications. "Repeat, Air Force 37129, nearest military-grade runway is Lincoln Airport, 157 miles from your position," came the controller's voice as communications restored. Rodriguez exchanged grim looks with Park. "We won't make Lincoln, not with 2 engines down and losing hydraulics. Omaha International, 90 miles, too far." She studied the navigation display, which flickered ominously. "We need something closer, anything." The controller's voice returned. "Air Force 37129, we show no commercial or military airfields within your operational radius, given current descent rate and reported system status." Park, working with the backup navigation system, suddenly pointed to a spot on the display. "There, unregistered airstrip, approximately 7 miles from our position. Looks like a farm? No tower, no services, but satellite imagery shows nearly 5,000 feet of maintained grass runway." Rodriguez squinted at the coordinates. The strip wasn't in their database, appearing only as a geographical anomaly on satellite overlay. "That's not even a registered landing site," she said. "Surface condition unknown, no approach lighting, possible obstructions." Through the cockpit window, the lightning illuminated the countryside below, revealing patchworks of farmland. Somewhere down there was their only hope. "Options?" Rodriguez asked, already knowing the answer. "Controlled crash landing in a field, or try for the unregistered strip," Park replied grimly. The aircraft lurched as hydraulic pressure fluctuated. Decision time had arrived. McConnell approach, Air Force 37129 diverting to unregistered landing site at coordinates 41.3, 97.8. Please alert emergency services. Richard was halfway up the stairs to bed when he heard it. A deep, throbbing sound, unlike the typical small aircraft that occasionally passed overhead. This was larger, more powerful, and clearly in distress. The irregular rhythm of multiple engines vibrated through the farmhouse walls. He rushed to the window as Sarah appeared beside him, concern etched across her face. Through patches in the storm clouds, they could see navigation lights descending rapidly, banking toward their property. "My God," Richard whispered. "That's a military transport." Years in the Air Force had trained his eyes and ears to recognize aircraft types. This was no civilian plane, and it was coming in dangerously fast and low. "Should we call someone?" Sarah asked, clutching her robe around her. Before Richard could answer, the farmhouse was bathed in brilliant light as powerful landing beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the runway he'd maintained for decades without explanation. In that moment, it all made sense. They're going to attempt a landing, he realized, already moving, adrenaline overriding the arthritis in his knees. "Get Michael, tell him to start the tractors and turn them toward the runway. We need more light." Richard ran to the barn as the roar of failing engines grew louder. Inside, he flipped switches on the electrical panel, activating the rudimentary runway lights, simple, elevated lamps his father had installed decades ago, and that he'd meticulously maintained and upgraded to LEDs last year. He grabbed the old aviation radio, hands trembling as he tuned to the emergency frequency. Aircraft on approach to Thornton Farm landing strip. This is Richard Thornton on the ground. Runway is 5,000 feet, grass surface, clear of obstructions. Wind from the southwest at approximately 15 knots. No approach lighting, but I'm activating perimeter markers now. For a moment, there was only static. Then a woman's voice, professional but tense. Thornton Farm, this is Air Force 37129, C-17 Globemaster with multiple engine failures and electrical malfunctions. We are committed to approach. Any information on runway surface condition? Richard swallowed hard. A C-17? That was a massive military transport aircraft, far larger than anything this small farm runway had ever handled. Designed for rough airfields, yes, but typically military-grade surfaces, not a grass strip maintained by a single aging farmer. Runway is firm, recently mowed, he replied, praying that would be enough. No recent rain until tonight, so ground is solid. But be advised, this strip has never handled anything larger than a twin-engine Beechcraft. Understood, no alternatives within range. ETA 2 minutes. Richard ran back outside as Michael emerged from the house, keys to both tractors in hand. Dad, what's happening? No time to explain. Get the tractors positioned at the south end of the runway. High beams on. Now! As Michael sprinted toward the equipment barn, Sarah appeared with their daughter-in-law, Emma. Richard, that plane is too big, Sarah said, fear evident in her voice. I know, he answered grimly, watching the massive shape materializing through the clouds. But they don't have a choice. The C-17 Globemaster III, 174 feet long, with a wingspan of 170 feet, descended toward the narrow farm runway like a wounded giant. It weighed, even with fuel running low, nearly 300,000 pounds. Thousands of times heavier than any aircraft that had previously touched down on Richard Thornton's grass strip. Inside the cockpit, Captain Rodriguez had gone into a state of hyper-focus, her world narrowing to the instruments before her and the rapidly approaching ground. The aircraft's sophisticated heads-up display was intermittent, forcing her to rely more on visual reference than she'd have preferred for such a challenging approach. Forward runway edge identified, First Lieutenant Park called out, pointing to the faint line of lights now visible through the rain-streaked windshield. Approach looks clear, but the width is concerning. The C-17 needed a minimum of 90 feet of width for safe landing. From what they could see, the farm runway appeared to be perhaps 75 feet wide, another variable in an equation already filled with deadly uncertainties. Gear down, flaps at position 3, Rodriguez ordered, feeling the wounded aircraft respond sluggishly. Prepare for possible runway excursion. In the cargo hold, Master Sergeant Wilson had briefed all passengers, ensuring they were in crash positions with restraints double-checked. The CDC scientists looked terrified, understanding that their experimental vaccine materials, critical for an emerging public health threat, might be lost along with their lives. On the ground, Richard Thornton and his family worked with desperate speed. Michael and Emma had positioned both farm tractors at the touchdown zone, high beams creating a makeshift approach lighting system. Sarah had called neighbors who were arriving in pickup trucks to provide additional illumination. Richard stood in the rain at runway center, the old aviation radio clutched in his hand. Air Force 37129, be advised we've placed vehicles with lights at the approach end. Runway is approximately 75 feet wide. Surface remains firm but wet from current rainfall. Copy that, came Rodriguez's tense reply. Beginning final approach. Thornton, please clear all personnel from the runway immediately. Richard didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted to the side as the thunderous roar of the massive aircraft grew overwhelming. Through the rain, he watched its enormous shape materialize, landing lights creating tunnels through the darkness. The C-17 was coming in steep, steeper than normal approach parameters would allow, as Rodriguez attempted to minimize the runway length needed. Its massive wheels touched down with a squeal of rubber and a massive shower of water and grass, precisely at the runway threshold. Richard held his breath as reverse thrust engaged, the engine's roar changing pitch as they fought to slow the behemoth. Mud and grass sprayed in rooster tails behind the aircraft. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the C-17 would plow straight through the entire runway and into the cornfield beyond. Then, incredibly, the aircraft began to slow. Its nose wheel remained high, maximizing drag on the main landing gear. 200 yards, 400, 600. At 800 yards down the runway, the C-17 finally shuddered to a stop, its nose wheel gently settling onto Richard's meticulously maintained grass surface. For a moment, the only sound was the pinging of cooling metal and the steady drum of rain. Then, the rear ramp of the massive transport began to lower. Richard approached the aircraft cautiously, rain plastering his gray hair to his forehead. The C-17's massive bulk dwarfed everything on his farm, looking as alien as a spaceship against the rural backdrop. The rear ramp had fully deployed, casting yellow interior light onto the wet grass. A woman in a flight suit emerged, her captain's bars visible as she approached. Captain Melissa Rodriguez, United States Air Force. She introduced herself, extending a hand. You must be Richard Thornton. Richard nodded, shaking her hand. Are you all right? Anyone hurt? Minor injuries only, thanks to you, she replied, looking back at the impossible sight of her massive military transport resting on a farm runway. I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Thornton. You saved a lot of lives tonight. Before Richard could respond, a tall man in a dark suit approached from the aircraft, flanked by 2 military police officers. Captain, secure perimeter now. This is still a classified operation. Rodriguez straightened. Sir, this man just saved our aircraft and everyone on board. The man barely acknowledged Richard. I understand, but protocols remain in place. He turned to Richard. Sir, I'm going to need you and your family to return to your residence while we secure the aircraft and its contents. Richard bristled. This is my property, despite what the bank says for the next 29 days. The standoff was interrupted by urgent shouts from inside the aircraft. A woman in a lab coat appeared at the ramp. The cooling system is completely offline. We have less than 30 minutes before temperature compromise. The man in the suit cursed under his breath, then turned to the captain. Options? Rodriguez shook her head. Aircraft power systems are fried. Emergency generators are maintaining basic functions only. The specialized refrigeration units need more power than we can provide. Richard cleared his throat. I have 3 industrial generators in the barn. Installed them 5 years ago when we had the big storms. They can power half the farm. For the first time, the man in the suit really looked at Richard. What capacity? Enough to run the grain dryers, which pull more power than anything I've ever seen, Richard replied. What are you trying to keep cold? A tense conversation unfolded between the officials while Richard stood in the rain. Finally, Rodriguez approached him again. Mr. Thornton, what I'm about to tell you is classified. We're transporting experimental vaccine materials that require constant refrigeration. If they warm beyond certain parameters, months of research is lost. Given our situation, we need your help. Within minutes, the farm transformed into an impromptu military operation. Michael and Richard connected their generators while Sarah opened their home to the injured and the officers coordinating their response. Emma, a nurse at the regional hospital, tended to those with minor injuries. As civilian technicians carefully moved specialized containers from the aircraft to the farm's utility building, Richard caught glimpses of biohazard symbols and government markings he hadn't seen since his military days. Vaccine research? He asked Rodriguez quietly as they worked to establish a secure power connection. She hesitated. Yes, for a pathogen most people haven't heard of yet, but they will. She looked at him meaningfully. What you're doing isn't just saving our mission, Mr. Thornton. It could potentially save thousands of lives down the line. By dawn, as emergency response vehicles finally reached the isolated farm, the classified cargo had been stabilized. Military helicopters circled overhead, preparing for evacuation of the critical materials. Richard watched from his porch, exhaustion settling over him as the sun rose over his farm, a farm that, in just over 4 weeks, would no longer be his. 3 days after the emergency landing, Richard sat at his kitchen table, staring at a letter he couldn't quite believe. Sarah read it over his shoulder, her hand pressed against her mouth. "Is this real?" she whispered. The letter, on Department of Defense letterhead, outlined the terms clearly. A long-term lease of Thornton Farm as an emergency contingency landing site for military and government aircraft, with specific requirements for maintaining the runway to newly established C-17 capable standards. The annual payment would be 3 times what the farm generated in its best agricultural years. According to Captain Rodriguez, it's not only real, it's already been processed, Richard said, still stunned. The bank called this morning. The foreclosure has been withdrawn. In the days following the emergency landing, Thornton Farm had seen more activity than in the previous decade combined. Military engineers had examined the runway, amazed at its condition given its unofficial status. The fact that a C-17 had successfully landed and could be repaired on site rather than scrapped was considered nothing short of miraculous. "There's more," Richard continued, turning the page. "They want to hire Michael as the site manager, given his engineering background. Full benefits, government pension track." Sarah sank into a chair. "All because you kept mowing that runway when everyone thought you were crazy." Richard looked through the window at the massive aircraft still parked on his grass strip. Engineers had determined it could be repaired where it stood, and the effort had turned into an impromptu demonstration of remote field maintenance capabilities that had generals and civilian contractors flying in daily. What no one had told the Thorntons yet was that the vaccine materials they had helped save had been the culmination of years of research, aimed at a viral strain with pandemic potential that had emerged in Southeast Asia. The emergency landing, while unplanned, had actually expedited the delivery of critical samples to researchers who had been awaiting them. That afternoon, as Richard walked the length of his runway, he was approached by Captain Rodriguez, who was preparing to depart on one of the helicopters. "I've been authorized to tell you something, Mr. Thornton," she said, falling into step beside him. "Your farm is being designated as more than just an emergency landing site. The unique geography and isolation make it ideal for certain types of classified transportation needs." "Meaning?" Richard asked. "Meaning that runway you've been maintaining all these years? It's going to become a vital link in a chain that helps protect this country." She smiled. "You weren't crazy to keep it mowed, Mr. Thornton. You were preparing, even if you didn't know what for." As the sun set on Thornton Farm that evening, Richard stood on his porch, the porch that would remain his after all, and watched as lights were installed along the full length of the runway. A team of contractors had already broken ground on a small control building, and engineers were marking out expanded dimensions for the strip. Michael approached, plans tucked under his arm, excitement in his eyes that Richard hadn't seen since his son was a boy. "They want to name it, Dad. Make it official with the FAA and military aviation charts." "Name what?" "The runway. They're registering it as Thornton Field." Richard nodded, emotion tightening his throat. 4 generations of his family had worked this land, but it would be his name on the field that might serve for generations to come. As he looked out across the farm, his family's past, and now, unexpectedly, its future, Richard thought about how thin the line was between disaster and miracle. One decision, maintained over years against all logic, had saved not only his family's legacy, but perhaps countless lives through the vaccine research that had reached its destination against impossible odds. Sometimes, Richard reflected, you maintain a runway without knowing exactly what will land there. You just have faith that something will. That's it for today's incredible true story of how one farmer's stubborn dedication led to a miracle that saved lives and changed everything. If you were blown away by this amazing tale of fate and determination, smash the like button and hit subscribe for more unbelievable stories that restore your faith in humanity. Tell us in the comments what you would do if a massive military plane tried to land on your property. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that sometimes what seems like stubbornness can actually be preparation for something amazing. See you in the next video.